In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy sent pilots to war with an average of 700 hours in the cockpit. By January 1945, replacement pilots arrived at combat squadrons with barely 200 hours of flight time. In March 1945, the Empire of Japan suspended all powered flight training entirely. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The mathematics of this collapse was written not in doctrine or strategy, but in petroleum. Japan began the Pacific War with the finest naval aviators in the world and ended it sending teenagers into battle who could barely keep a fighter level in straight flight. This was not a training philosophy. It was a fuel crisis so severe that it transformed an empire's air power from predator to prey in less than 4 years. The story of how Japan lost the Pacific War begins, paradoxically, not with the battles everyone remembers, but with something far more mundane, the gallons of gasoline that never made it to training airfields across the home islands. Every Zero that never practiced aerobatics, every carrier landing that went unrehearsed, every bombing run that existed only in classroom theory represented a future battle already lost before the first shot was fired. This is the story of how Japan's fuel shortage destroyed the very foundation of their aerial warfare doctrine, and in doing so, guaranteed their defeat. The empire's aviation aristocracy. In the years before Pearl Harbor, becoming a naval aviator in Imperial Japan was comparable to joining the priesthood of an elite warrior cult. The selection process began not with flight but with character. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy initiated the Yokoren program, a pipeline designed to transform promising teenagers into naval aviators. Boys as young as 14 applied for admission, facing entrance examinations that tested mathematics, reading comprehension, physical fitness, and psychological resilience. The acceptance rate hovered between 5 and 8%. Those who passed entered a 30-month program of education covering navigation, engineering principles, aerodynamics, and military discipline before ever touching an aircraft's controls. The curriculum demanded total commitment. Students lived in barracks under conditions designed to forge unity through shared hardship. They rose before dawn for calisthenics, spent mornings in academic instruction, afternoons in military drill, evenings in study. The few hours reserved for sleep came in dormitories where individual privacy did not exist. The program sought not merely competent pilots but warriors whose identity merged completely with naval aviation service. The path was brutal by design. The Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Itajima accepted only the finest candidates, young men aged 16 to 19 who survived entrance examinations so rigorous that acceptance rates hovered below 10%. Those who passed faced 3 years of academic and military instruction before ever setting foot in an aircraft. For enlisted men, the route was equally unforgiving. The Flight Reserve Enlisted Training Program, known as the Yokoren, required candidates to complete 2.5 years of education before beginning flight instruction. This was not pilot training in the American sense, where volume and standardization produced competent aviators in months. This was the forging of aerial samurai, individuals whose skill in the cockpit bordered on the supernatural. The numbers told the story of this excellence. Officers completing flight training in 1940 logged a minimum of 400 hours in the air before assignment to operational units. Enlisted pilots accumulated 250 hours during training, then spent months or years in squadron service before seeing combat. By the time the average Imperial Japanese Navy pilot attacked Pearl Harbor, he carried between 600 and 800 hours of flight experience, much of it accumulated in the brutal skies over China where Japanese aviators refined their craft against live opponents. The training system produced pilots who could coax performance from their aircraft that Western engineers insisted was aerodynamically impossible. They executed snap rolls at speeds that should have torn their fighters apart. They navigated by dead reckoning across 1,000 miles of empty ocean and arrived over their targets within minutes of scheduled time. They landed on carrier decks in weather that grounded American squadrons. This was not propaganda. This was verified capability, purchased at extraordinary cost in time, fuel, and instructional resources. Those who survived this selection crucible then entered flight training proper. The program divided into stages, each progressively more demanding. Primary training utilized Yokosuka K-5Y biplane trainers, simple aircraft with forgiving handling characteristics. Students learned basic control inputs, takeoff and landing procedures, elementary aerobatics. This phase consumed approximately 50 hours of flight time spread across 3 months. Intermediate training introduced more complex aircraft, the Mitsubishi K-3M monoplane trainer or similar types capable of higher performance. Students practiced formation flying, cross-country navigation, and advanced aerobatics including loops, rolls, and split-S maneuvers. This phase added another 60 hours over 4 months. Advanced training separated students into specialty tracks, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance, or torpedo aircraft. Fighter students flew retired A-5M Claude fighters or early Model Zeros, learning air combat maneuvering, gunnery against towed targets, and high-G aerobatic sequences. Bomber students practiced level bombing, dive bombing, and skip bombing techniques. Torpedo students learned the demanding skill of low-altitude attack runs against maneuvering ship targets. Advanced training consumed 150 to 200 hours across 5 months. Upon completion, pilots joined operational squadrons where they continued training under squadron instructors before being certified as combat-ready. The entire pipeline from Yokren entry to combat certification required 3 to 4 years. The Mitsubishi A6M0 embodied this philosophy of elite aviation perfected through intensive training. The aircraft carried 130 gallons of fuel in its internal tanks, extendable to 219 gallons with an external drop tank. The Nakajima Seiki engine consumed approximately 18 gallons per hour at cruise settings, giving the Zero an operational endurance of 6 to 8 hours with external fuel. This remarkable range came at a price. The Zero lacked armor protection. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A single incendiary bullet could transform the aircraft into a flying torch. Japanese designers accepted these vulnerabilities because their doctrine assumed that superior pilot skill would prevent enemy fighters from achieving firing position in the first place. The training system existed to create pilots who could exploit the Zero's extreme maneuverability while avoiding the consequences of its fragility. This required hundreds of hours practicing aerobatic maneuvers, gunnery against towed targets, formation flying, and overwater navigation. Every flight hour in training consumed fuel. Every gallon of aviation gasoline represented crude oil that had to be extracted, refined to 91 or 92 octane standards, transported to storage facilities, and distributed to training airfields. In 1941, Japan possessed adequate fuel supplies to sustain this training system. The nation imported oil from the United States, produced modest quantities from domestic sources, and maintained strategic reserves sufficient for sustained operations. The petroleum dependency was not abstract economic theory but physical reality measured in barrels and tanker voyages. Japan's military consumed approximately 49 million barrels of oil annually during peacetime operations, a figure that would increase dramatically during wartime mobilization. Domestic production from fields in Niigata, Akita, and Sakhalin contributed approximately 300,000 barrels per year, less than 1% of total requirements. The remainder came from imports, primarily from the United States, which supplied 80% of Japanese petroleum consumption. This dependence created strategic vulnerability that American policymakers understood and eventually exploited. The oil embargo was not sudden policy shift but culmination of graduated pressure intended to constrain Japanese military expansion without triggering immediate war. In July 1940, the United States restricted exports of aviation gasoline and high-grade scrap iron to Japan. In September 1940, these restrictions expanded to include all scrap metal. Throughout this period, crude oil continued flowing from American ports to Japanese tankers, maintaining the economic relationship while signaling diplomatic displeasure. Then, in July 1941, the Roosevelt administration imposed a total oil embargo in response to Japanese military expansion in Indochina. Japan faced a choice between abandoning its imperial ambitions or seizing alternative petroleum sources by force. The Dutch East Indies possessed some of the richest oil fields in the world, producing 65 million barrels annually. British Borneo added additional reserves. These territories became Japan's primary strategic objective when the decision for war crystallized in Tokyo. The attack on Pearl Harbor existed to neutralize American naval power while Japanese forces secured the oil-rich southern regions. The plan succeeded brilliantly in its initial phase. By March 1942, Japan controlled the major oil production centers of Palembang, Balikpapan, and Tarakan. Crude oil flowed northward in tankers toward refineries in the home islands. The Imperial Japanese Navy had secured its energy lifeline. The decision for war represented gamble predicated on assumptions that proved catastrophically incorrect. Japanese strategists calculated that American industrial capacity, while vast, would require years to mobilize for Pacific warfare. They assumed that early victories would create defensive perimeter so extensive that American forces would face prohibitive costs attempting to breach it. They believed that a negotiated peace preserving Japanese territorial gains remained achievable if initial operations succeeded decisively. Most critically, they assumed that control of Dutch East Indies oil fields would solve their petroleum shortage, providing secure fuel supplies adequate for sustained operations. This final assumption proved most destructive. Capturing oil fields was straightforward. Japanese forces secured Palembang, Balikpapan, and Tarakan by March 1942 with minimal resistance. Production resumed within months. Crude oil existed in abundance. The problem was transportation. What Japanese planners failed to anticipate was the vulnerability of this extended supply chain to sustained American counterattack. The petroleum had to travel thousands of miles through contested waters. Every tanker represented an irreplaceable asset. Every gallon of crude oil lost to submarine torpedoes could never be recovered. The fuel crisis that would eventually destroy Japanese pilot training did not announce itself with dramatic shortages in 1942. It arrived as a gradual constriction, a slowly tightening noose around the empire's ability to maintain its training infrastructure. The mathematics were straightforward and unforgiving. Japan needed petroleum to fight the war. It needed petroleum to train the pilots who would fight the war. It possessed finite tanker capacity. As American submarines began hunting in the shipping lanes between the East Indies and Japan, Japanese commanders faced an impossible choice: allocate fuel to combat operations or allocate fuel to training the next generation of pilots. They chose combat operations. The consequences of this decision would take years to fully manifest, but the outcome was inevitable from the moment the choice was made. The mathematics of petroleum warfare. The American submarine campaign against Japanese shipping began on December 8, 1941, when USS Gudgeon departed Pearl Harbor on patrol. The submarine force entered the war with advantages and deficiencies that would shape the entire campaign. American submarines were technological marvels, fleet boats displacing 1,500 tons with diesel engines capable of 20 knot surface speed and 9 knot submerged. They carried 24 torpedoes and possessed operational range exceeding 10,000 miles, allowing deployments lasting 60 days or more. The crews were professional volunteers, skilled technicians capable of maintaining complex machinery under combat conditions. But the weapon they relied upon, the Mark 14 torpedo, was fundamentally defective in ways that would cost American forces dearly through the war's first 2 years. The Mark 14 suffered from 3 primary defects, each stemming from inadequate testing during peacetime development. The magnetic influence exploder designed to detonate beneath a target's keel proved unreliable, frequently firing prematurely or failing to fire at all. The contact exploder had a design flaw where impact at angles less than 90 degrees caused the firing pin to jam, preventing detonation. The depth control mechanism consistently ran 10 feet deeper than set depth, causing torpedoes aimed at a ship's waterline to pass harmlessly underneath. These problems were not hypothetical concerns discovered through analysis. They were tactical failures experienced repeatedly by submarine commanders who achieved perfect attack geometry, fired torpedoes at point-blank range, and watched targets sail away unharmed. The frustration corroded morale and eroded confidence in submarine doctrine. Commanders began questioning their own competence rather than recognizing that the weapon itself was flawed. The early months proved frustrating. Torpedo failures plagued the submarine force. The Mark 14 torpedo suffered from defective depth control mechanisms and faulty magnetic exploders that frequently failed to detonate. Submarine commanders reported perfect attack geometry, heard the torpedo strike the target hull, and watched helplessly as Japanese cargo ships sailed onward unscathed. The technical problems persisted through 1942, costing American submariners numerous opportunities and eroding confidence in their primary weapon. But by late 1943, the torpedo deficiencies had been identified and corrected. American submarine doctrine evolved from opportunistic attacks against targets of convenience to systematic destruction of specific vessel types. In November 1943, the United States Navy designated tankers as the highest priority target category for submarine operations. The reasoning was strategic and coldly logical. Japan's war machine consumed petroleum. Sinking tankers produced cascading effects across the entire Japanese military structure. Aviation operations depended on refined gasoline. Naval vessels required fuel oil. Ground forces needed diesel for transport. The mechanized warfare Japan had embraced demanded continuous petroleum supply. Cut the oil flow and the empire's capacity for sustained operations would collapse. The torpedo crisis resolved slowly through field modifications and systematic testing. The magnetic exploder was deactivated in mid-1943 after numerous documented failures. The depth control problem was identified and corrected through adjustments to the hydrostatic mechanism. The contact exploder flaw took longest to solve, requiring redesign of the firing pin assembly. By late 1943, American submarines finally possessed reliable torpedoes. The impact on Japanese shipping was immediate and catastrophic. Submarine commanders who had endured 2 years of weapon failures now found their attacks succeeding with regularity. The Mark 14 torpedo, properly functioning, could break the back of any merchant vessel with a single hit. Tankers, with their volatile petroleum cargoes, often exploded spectacularly when struck. The statistics of this campaign reveal its devastating effectiveness. In 1941, Japan imported approximately 49 million barrels of crude oil. After capturing the Dutch East Indies fields, production capacity existed to meet Japanese demand. But production meant nothing if the petroleum never reached Japanese refineries. In 1942, American submarines sank approximately 180,000 tons of Japanese tanker capacity. The number doubled in 1943. By 1944, submarine attacks destroyed over 900,000 tons of tanker shipping, faster than Japanese shipyards could replace the losses. The mathematics became unsustainable. Japan built or captured tankers displacing approximately 200,000 tons in 1944. American submarines sank more than 4 times that tonnage in the same period. The tanker fleet that connected Japanese strategic calculations to physical reality was being systematically destroyed. Japanese tanker crews faced the highest casualty rates of any maritime service in the war. The voyage from Palembang to Yokohama became a death sentence. Tankers sailed without adequate escort protection because Japan lacked sufficient destroyer hulls to guard every convoy. They attempted circuitous routing to avoid known submarine patrol areas, adding days to each voyage and further reducing effective tanker capacity. They unloaded at night and departed before dawn to minimize vulnerability to aerial reconnaissance. None of these measures proved adequate against American submarines equipped with improved torpedoes, enhanced radar, and increasingly aggressive commanders. The oil blockade produced a cascade of consequences that Japanese logistics planners struggled desperately to mitigate. Crude oil imports fell from 49 million barrels in 1941 to 24 million barrels in 1943, then collapsed to 10 million barrels in 1944. By April 1945, oil imports had ceased entirely. Japan possessed some domestic oil production, approximately 300,000 barrels annually from fields in northern Honshu and Sakhalin. This represented less than 1% of the nation's petroleum requirements. Stockpiles accumulated before the war provided temporary buffer against supply disruption, but these reserves depleted steadily as import capacity dwindled. The home island's refineries sat increasingly idle, lacking crude petroleum to process. Aviation gasoline production peaked in 1943, then fell precipitously as feedstock supplies constricted. By 1944, Japan faced not merely a shortage of aviation fuel but a crisis that threatened to ground the entire Japanese Air Force. the Imperial Japanese Navy confronted an agonizing allocation problem. Fuel existed in finite quantities. Combat operations demanded priority. Carriers required fuel oil to sortie. Fighters needed gasoline to intercept B-29 bombers attacking industrial targets. Ground attack aircraft consumed fuel supporting defensive operations in the Philippines, Okinawa, and eventually the home islands themselves. Every gallon diverted to training represented a gallon unavailable for combat missions. In June 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy made the decision that sealed the fate of its aviation forces. Training allocations were cut 40%. Flight schools that had previously operated on standardized curricula emphasizing comprehensive skill development shifted to abbreviated programs focused on immediate combat necessities. The change reflected strategic desperation disguised as tactical adaptation. In practice, this meant that pilots who formerly accumulated 300 hours of flight training before joining operational squadrons now received half that preparation. Advanced aerobatic training was curtailed. Extended overwater navigation exercises were replaced with abbreviated coastal flights. Gunnery training against towed targets was reduced from dozens of practice sessions to single-digit opportunities. Night flying instruction, always dangerous and fuel-intensive, was virtually eliminated. The entire structure of Japanese pilot training began to compress and collapse under the remorseless pressure of petroleum scarcity. American intelligence monitored these changes through multiple channels. Interrogation of captured Japanese aircrew revealed the declining training standards. Performance analysis of Japanese aircraft in combat showed increasing pilot errors, poor formation discipline, and basic flight handling deficiencies. Photographic reconnaissance identified reduced activity at Japanese training airfields. By late 1943, American intelligence officers understood that Japan faced a training crisis that would progressively degrade the quality of its aviation forces. The only unknown variable was how rapidly the degradation would manifest in combat effectiveness. The answer came with devastating clarity in June 1944, in the skies above the Philippine Sea. The harvest of untrained pilots. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19 through 20, 1944, demonstrated with brutal finality what happens when inadequately trained pilots encounter combat conditions. The battle emerged from American strategic operations in the Central Pacific, where Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the Fifth Fleet supporting marine landings on Saipan in the Mariana Islands. Japanese naval doctrine viewed the loss of the Marianas as unacceptable. These islands represented the inner defensive perimeter protecting the home islands from direct air attack. American possession of the Marianas would place B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of Tokyo. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, ordered Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa to engage and destroy the American carrier forces supporting the Saipan invasion. The operation, designated AGO, represented Japan's last opportunity to achieve a decisive naval victory that might alter the war's trajectory. Ozawa assembled a force of 9 aircraft carriers, the fleet carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zyukaku, the light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, Ryuho, Junyo, and Hyo. The carriers embarked 473 aircraft including 222 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, 113 Yokosuka D4Y Judy dive bombers, 95 Nakajima B6N JIL torpedo bombers, and 43 reconnaissance and miscellaneous types. Supporting the carriers were 5 battleships, 11 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 28 destroyers. On paper, this represented formidable striking power. But the human element within those 473 aircraft cockpits told a different story. The Japanese assembled a carrier strike force designated Mobile Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. The fleet included 9 aircraft carriers embarking approximately 473 aircraft. On paper, this represented significant striking power. In reality, most of the pilots manning these aircraft had completed abbreviated training programs rushed through on constricted fuel allocations. Many had fewer than 200 hours of total flight time. Some had logged as few as 150 hours before assignment to carrier duty. They possessed theoretical knowledge of carrier operations but lacked the instinctive responses that only extensive practice could provide. The difference between theoretical understanding and muscle memory competence would prove fatal. The American force opposing them represented the most powerful naval aviation concentration ever assembled. Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell deployed 15 aircraft carriers with more than 900 aircraft. American pilots averaged between 300 and 600 hours of flight training, many of them veterans of earlier Pacific battles. They flew Grumman F-6F Hellcats specifically designed to counter the Zero through superior firepower, armor protection, and high-speed performance. The Hellcat sacrificed maneuverability for durability, accepting that American pilots might not outturn Japanese fighters but could absorb more damage and hit harder. The design philosophy reflected American industrial capacity and training infrastructure that allowed replacing both aircraft and pilots faster than combat consumed them. The battle began on the morning of June 19 when Japanese strike aircraft launched from their carriers. American radar detected the inbound formations at extreme range, providing ample warning time. Hellcat fighters vectored to intercept positions, achieving altitude advantage before the Japanese aircraft arrived. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that captured both the lopsided nature of the combat and the terrible human cost paid by young Japanese aviators flying into conditions they were unprepared to survive. The first wave of Japanese attackers numbered 69 aircraft. American Hellcats destroyed 42 of them. The second wave of 109 aircraft lost 98. The third wave, 97 aircraft, suffered losses of 47 planes. The fourth wave, 82 aircraft, lost 73. By day's end, the Japanese had lost approximately 350 aircraft in exchange for minimal damage to American ships and negligible losses among defending fighters. The slaughter stemmed not from Japanese cowardice but from the inevitable consequence of inadequate training meeting superior opposition. Japanese pilots attempted to execute complex attack profiles requiring precise coordination between dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. They lacked the flight time to maintain formation discipline under fire. When American interceptors attacked, Japanese formations disintegrated. Individual pilots reverted to survival instincts rather than tactical doctrine, breaking formation and attempting to escape rather than maintaining cohesion. Zero fighters that might have protected the bombers became separated in the confused aerial melee. Dive bomber pilots missed their targets by hundreds of yards, unable to compensate for anti-aircraft fire while maintaining bombing accuracy. Torpedo bombers dropped their weapons outside effective range, wasting ordnance against evasive targets. The entire carefully planned strike degenerated into a chaotic disaster where individual courage could not compensate for systematic training deficiencies. The American fighter pilots' accounts from the battle describe target-rich environments where Japanese formations disintegrated under the first pass. Lieutenant Alex Vrashu of VF-16, flying from USS Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in 8 minutes during a single engagement. His gun camera footage showed aircraft flying straight and level, presenting perfect deflection angles, pilots apparently unaware of their tactical situation until bullets struck their aircraft. Commander David McCampbell, commanding officer of Air Group 15 from USS Essex, described attacking a formation of 40 Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers escorted by Zero fighters. The formation maintained parade ground spacing, beautiful to observe but tactically suicidal. When McCampbell's Hellcat division attacked from above, the Japanese formation did not execute defensive breaks or coordinated maneuvers. Individual aircraft simply scattered, each pilot reacting independently without coordination with wingmen or section leaders. McCampbell shot down 5 aircraft in a single pass before his ammunition exhausted. Other pilots in his division accounted for additional kills. The entire formation was destroyed before any Japanese aircraft released weapons against American ships. American pilots reported that Japanese aircraft fell to gunnery solutions that would have been impossible against the skilled aviators of 1941. Japanese fighters flew predictable patterns, failed to execute coordinated defensive breaks, and presented deflection angles that made tracking straightforward for experienced American gunners. The reports were not boastful but clinically analytical. American intelligence recognized that the quality degradation represented an irreversible strategic shift. Japan could still produce aircraft. The nation retained industrial capacity to build Zeros, Judys, Jills, and other types. But Japan could no longer produce pilots capable of employing those aircraft effectively. The training infrastructure had collapsed under the weight of fuel scarcity. The battle cost Japan not merely 350 aircraft but, more critically, approximately 450 pilots killed or missing. These losses exceeded Japan's monthly pilot production capacity. The mathematics of attrition became inescapable. Japan was losing pilots faster than its training system could replace them, and the replacement pilots arriving at squadrons possessed progressively less preparation. The Battle of the Philippine Sea represented the point where American intelligence could confidently predict Japanese defeat. The timeline might remain uncertain, but the outcome had become inevitable. Japan could not win an attrition war where each generation of pilots entered combat with fewer skills than the previous generation. Vice Admiral Ozawa's after-action report acknowledged the disaster in language carefully chosen to minimize political repercussions while stating the operational reality. His pilots lacked the training time necessary to execute complex carrier operations. The fuel shortages that precipitated this training crisis showed no signs of amelioration. American submarine operations continued to sink Japanese tankers faster than they could be replaced. The petroleum flow from the Dutch East Indies had slowed to a trickle. Aviation gasoline stockpiles in the home islands depleted steadily. By late 1944, Japanese aviation training had entered terminal decline. The desperate measures. In October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy implemented a series of emergency modifications to pilot training intended to maximize combat pilot production despite fuel scarcity. The changes were formalized in directives issued from Naval General Staff Headquarters, drafted in language that emphasized strategic adaptation while carefully avoiding any admission of crisis. But the instructors at Kasumagura, Iwakuni, and other training bases understood the reality. The modifications represented systematic dismantling of the training infrastructure that had once produced the finest naval aviators in the world. Flight instructors who had themselves completed the rigorous pre-war program now faced orders to graduate students with less than one-quarter the preparation time those instructors had received. The moral burden fell heaviest on veteran aviators assigned to training duty, men who understood precisely how inadequately prepared their students were and equally understood that nothing could be done to change this reality. The curriculum changes began with elimination of what planners termed non-essential elements. Advanced aerobatics including snap rolls, inverted flight, and high-speed dives were deleted entirely from the syllabus. The reasoning held that these maneuvers, while impressive, consumed disproportionate training time and fuel relative to their tactical value. In practice, this reasoning was flawed. Advanced aerobatics taught pilots to maintain orientation and control authority in unusual attitudes, skills directly applicable to combat maneuvering. Pilots who lacked experience with unusual attitudes found themselves disoriented during combat, unable to recover when enemy attack forced their aircraft into steep dives or violent rolls. The skills deemed non-essential were precisely the ones that separated aviators capable of surviving combat from those who panicked when combat pushed them beyond familiar flight regimes. The changes reflected the thinking of men trapped between impossible alternatives, seeking any method to sustain aviation operations with resources inadequate to the task. Flight training hours were cut again, this time to a minimum threshold of 90 hours total flight time before operational assignment. This represented less than 1/7 the flight time that Pearl Harbor aviators had accumulated. Advanced training in aerobatics, instrument flying, and night operations was eliminated entirely. The curriculum focused exclusively on basic aircraft control, takeoff and landing procedures, and simplified attack patterns. Gunnery training consisted of a few passes at stationary ground targets. Formation flying received minimal instruction. Overwater navigation was considered an acceptable loss, replaced with classroom instruction using maps and compasses. The most significant change involved substitution of motorized flight training with alternative methods that consumed less petroleum. Glider training programs expanded dramatically. Wooden gliders required no fuel for operation, only a powered aircraft to tow them to altitude before release. Student pilots could practice basic control inputs, turning coordination, and landing approaches in gliders without consuming scarce aviation gasoline. The training provided limited value. Gliders responded differently than powered aircraft. Control forces differed. Engine management became theoretical rather than practical. Students learned to fly in an environment that bore only superficial resemblance to combat conditions. But gliders consumed no fuel, and fuel had become Japan's most precious strategic commodity. Ground-based training simulators saw increased utilization. The Imperial Japanese Navy had procured link trainers, primitive mechanical flight simulators that allowed students to practice instrument procedures without leaving the ground. The devices consisted of a covered cockpit mounted on a motion platform that could pitch and roll to simulate aircraft movement. Instructors monitored student performance from an external desk, providing corrections through a communication tube. Link trainers offered some value for basic instrument familiarity and procedural training. They could not replicate the physical sensations of actual flight, the G-forces of aerobatic maneuvers, the visceral reality of engine vibration and wind noise, the precise control inputs required for carrier landing approaches. They represented a desperate measure, better than nothing but inadequate as substitute for actual flight training. Theoretical instruction expanded to fill the hours formerly allocated to flight time. Students spent more hours in classrooms studying aircraft systems, tactics, and procedures. They memorized checklist items. They sketched attack diagrams on blackboards. They calculated navigation solutions on paper. The education provided intellectual framework but could not create the muscle memory and instinctive responses that only actual flight experience produced. Japanese instructors understood this limitation. They lacked authority to change the policy. Fuel did not exist to support traditional training methods. The alternatives were accept degraded training standards or cease pilot production entirely. Ceasing production meant guaranteed defeat. Degraded standards offered the possibility, however remote, that sufficient numbers might compensate for individual deficiencies. Instrument flight training suffered similar reduction. The Imperial Japanese Navy had never emphasized instrument flying to the degree American forces did, but pre-war curricula included basic instruction in flying aircraft solely by reference to cockpit instruments. This training proved invaluable during night operations or when weather obscured visual references. Under fuel constraints, instrument training was cut to bare minimums. Students received classroom instruction on instrument interpretation but minimal actual flight time practicing instrument procedures. The consequence manifested in accidents. Pilots transitioning from visual flight to instrument conditions lost spatial orientation and crashed. Night operations became prohibitively dangerous as pilots lacking instrument proficiency struggled to maintain control. Without visual horizon reference, Japanese air operations progressively restricted themselves to daylight hours and clear weather conditions, constraints that reduced operational flexibility and allowed American forces to predict Japanese activity windows. By January 1945, the fuel situation had deteriorated beyond crisis to catastrophic. American submarines had severed the petroleum supply line from the Dutch East Indies. The last tanker convoy to reach Japan intact arrived in March 1945. Aviation gasoline stocks fell below levels necessary to sustain combat operations and training simultaneously. Japanese commanders faced the final allocation decision. In March 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy suspended all powered flight training. Students who had not yet completed their abbreviated programs would finish their instruction in gliders and ground school, then proceed directly to operational units without having soloed a combat aircraft. The decision represented admission that the training system had failed. Japan could no longer prepare pilots for combat. It could only send partially trained teenagers into battle and hope that determination might compensate for deficiency. The pilots produced under these terminal conditions possessed approximately 90 hours of flight time in unpowered gliders and obsolete training aircraft, supplemented by theoretical instruction in tactics they had never practiced. They could execute basic takeoffs and landings under ideal conditions. They struggled with crosswind approaches, heavy aircraft configurations, or emergency procedures. Formation flying at night was beyond their capability. They had never fired their aircraft's weapons in flight. They had never practiced high-G maneuvering. Most had never experienced the disorientation of combat where situational awareness collapsed under the pressure of incoming fire and rapidly changing tactical geometry. These were not pilots in any meaningful sense. They were sacrifices, young men sent to die in aircraft they barely understood against opponents whose training they could not match. American intelligence documents from early 1945 describe encounters with Japanese pilots who appeared unable to execute basic defensive maneuvers. Japanese fighters that flew in straight lines, presenting perfect gunnery solutions. Aircraft that attempted to land while American fighters were actively shooting at them, pilots apparently so focused on carrier approach procedures that they ignored the tactical situation. The reports make painful reading. They document not battles but executions, the systematic destruction of inadequately prepared young men flying machines they lacked the skill to employ. The fuel shortage that began as strategic constraint had metastasized into human catastrophe. The final accounting. The kamikaze tactics that emerged in October 1944 represented Japan's final admission that conventional pilot training had failed irreversibly. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi arrived in the Philippines in mid-October to assume command of the 1st Air Fleet, responsible for providing air support to Japanese ground forces defending against the American invasion of Leyte. The situation he inherited was desperate. His air fleet possessed approximately 100 operational aircraft, many in poor mechanical condition. His pilots averaged less than 200 hours of flight time, inadequate for conventional attack missions against defended shipping. American fighter defenses around the invasion fleet made traditional bombing or torpedo attacks nearly suicidal with marginal probability of success. Onishi convened his staff officers on October 19 and proposed a solution that shocked even officers accustomed to the brutalities of Pacific warfare: organized suicide attacks where pilots would deliberately crash bomb-laden aircraft into enemy ships. The concept was not entirely new. Individual Japanese pilots had resorted to ramming attacks when their aircraft was damaged beyond capability to return to base, choosing to die killing enemies rather than die uselessly. But Onishi proposed systematizing these individual acts of desperation into formal doctrine, establishing units specifically trained and equipped for suicide missions. The tactical logic was compelling if horrific. A conventional bombing attack required a skilled pilot to navigate to the target, evade fighter intercept, survive anti-aircraft fire, acquire the target visually, execute a precision approach, release weapons at exactly the correct altitude and angle, then escape the target area and return to base. Each step demanded skills acquired through extensive training. The entire sequence required perhaps 400 hours of flight preparation to execute with reasonable probability of success. A kamikaze attack required only the ability to fly an aircraft to the approximate target location and aim the machine at a large ship. Even minimally trained pilots could accomplish this mission. The explosive payload carried by the aircraft replaced the need for precision. A kamikaze that struck anywhere on a carrier's flight deck achieved military effect. Perfect accuracy was unnecessary. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi organized the first special attack units in the Philippines, groups of pilots who would deliberately crash explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. The tactic was presented as manifestation of Bushido warrior spirit, but the operational calculus was brutally practical. Hitting a moving ship with bombs or torpedoes required skilled pilots executing complex attack profiles. Japan no longer possessed the fuel to train such pilots. A kamikaze attack required only the ability to fly an aircraft to the target area and aim the machine at a large object. Even minimally trained pilots could accomplish this mission. The explosive payload made accuracy less critical. A near miss that damaged the flight deck achieved military effect comparable to a precision bomb hit. The kamikaze doctrine represented optimization for the resources Japan still possessed: aircraft, explosives, and young men willing to die for their nation. Approximately 4,000 pilots flew kamikaze missions between October 1944 and August 1945. They sank 34 Allied vessels and damaged hundreds more. The casualty rates among Allied naval personnel were severe. But kamikaze tactics could not alter strategic outcomes. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to build sufficient aircraft to overwhelm American defenses. The fuel shortage that prevented training conventional pilots also limited the number of kamikaze sorties Japan could generate. American forces adapted defensive measures, concentrating anti-aircraft fire and employing radar picket destroyers to provide early warning. By mid-1945, the effectiveness of kamikaze attacks had declined as American defensive doctrine evolved to counter the threat. The fuel crisis simultaneously devastated conventional defensive operations. When B-29 Superfortress bombers began attacking Japanese cities in November 1944, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy assembled interceptor squadrons to oppose the raids. The interceptors achieved some successes, shooting down isolated bombers and forcing formations to bomb from higher altitudes. But Japanese fighters could not sustain continuous operations. Fuel shortages limited the number of aircraft that could be launched per raid. Pilots who did engage often found their attacks disrupted by fuel management problems. The home island's defense required fighters to climb to altitudes above 30,000 feet, engage bombers flying at 25,000 feet or higher, execute gun passes, then return to base. The fuel consumption for such profiles exceeded the endurance capabilities of most Japanese fighters carrying realistic combat loads. Pilots found themselves forced to break off attacks not because they faced overwhelming opposition but because their fuel gauges approached empty. The first organized kamikaze attack occurred on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 50 fighters loaded with 250-kilogram bombs launched from Mabalacat Airfield, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki. The formation navigated to the area where American escort carriers operated, providing air support for ground forces ashore. Seki's aircraft struck USS St. Lo, an escort carrier, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the hangar bay where aviation gasoline and armed aircraft created a secondary explosion that destroyed the ship. Other kamikaze aircraft struck USS Santee, USS Suwannee, and USS Kitkan Bay, causing significant damage. The attacks demonstrated that even inadequately trained pilots could inflict serious casualties when employed as guided missiles. Admiral Onish's Gamble had succeeded in its immediate tactical objective. The strategic question was whether Japan possessed sufficient aircraft and willing pilots to sustain kamikaze operations at a scale that might influence the war's outcome. The answer proved to be no, constrained by the same petroleum shortage that had destroyed conventional pilot training. Kamikaze tactics did not eliminate the need for fuel. Aircraft had to fly from base to target. Escort fighters accompanying kamikaze formations consumed gasoline for their missions. Training flights, even abbreviated ones teaching basic aircraft control to suicide pilots, required fuel. Japan's petroleum crisis meant that kamikaze attacks occurred in pulses, concentrated efforts when fuel stocks permitted, followed by periods of inactivity while tankers attempted to deliver additional supplies. The most intensive kamikaze operations occurred during the Okinawa campaign, April through June 1945, when Japan launched approximately 1,500 suicide sorties. These attacks sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 others, inflicting more casualties on the United States Navy than any other campaign in the Pacific War. But even this effort could not prevent American conquest of Okinawa. Japan lacked the fuel to sustain attack rates high enough to halt American operations. The petroleum shortage had another consequence rarely discussed in popular histories: it prevented Japanese pilots from relocating. In a mobile war requiring aircraft to deploy from one base to another in response to enemy movements, fuel scarcity meant that fighters often remained grounded at airfields far from combat zones while battles occurred elsewhere. American forces invading Okinawa in April 1945 faced Japanese air attacks that were substantial in the first days but declined rapidly as Japanese fighters consumed their limited fuel allocations. By June, Okinawa-based American aircraft operated with near impunity not because Japanese fighters had been destroyed but because they lacked fuel to fly from airfields in Kyushu to the combat zone, execute missions, and return. The petroleum crisis had rendered the remaining Japanese air strength immobile, chained to local defense of bases where fuel supplies remained available. By August 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed approximately 4,500 combat aircraft, more than the combined air strength that attacked Pearl Harbor. The Imperial Japanese Army controlled approximately 5,500 aircraft. On paper, Japan retained formidable air power. In reality, most of these aircraft were incapable of sustained operations. Pilot quality ranged from poor to non-existent. Many aircraft lacked sufficient fuel for a single mission. Some sat on airfields with empty tanks, immobilized for weeks because petroleum deliveries had ceased. The Japanese strategy for defending against the anticipated American invasion, Operation Downfall, planned to employ thousands of kamikaze aircraft in mass attacks against the invasion fleet. The plan assumed adequate fuel would somehow materialize. No realistic petroleum supply chain existed to support the operation. Japan's final air defense rested on aircraft that lacked fuel and pilots who lacked training, facing an enemy whose industrial capacity and training infrastructure operated without resource constraints. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6 and 9, 1945, produced Japan's surrender before the fuel crisis reached its absolute conclusion. But the petroleum shortage had already determined the war's outcome. Japan could not have sustained defensive operations beyond September 1945. The remaining fuel stocks would have exhausted within weeks. Aircraft would have become immobile sculptures on abandoned airfields. Pilots would have reverted to infantry soldiers. The invasion that never occurred would have encountered not a functional air force but the wreckage of one, destroyed not by American bombs but by the systematic severance of petroleum supply lines that began in late 1943 and concluded in April 1945. Lessons written in petroleum. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, compiled after the war's conclusion, examined the effectiveness of various American campaigns against Japanese capability. The survey teams included economists, engineers, military analysts, and experienced combat officers who traveled across Japan in the months immediately following surrender, interviewing surviving Japanese officials, examining records, inspecting damaged facilities, and compiling data on industrial production, military capabilities, and strategic resource consumption. The petroleum section of the survey produced particularly damning conclusions about Japanese strategic planning. The report noted that Japan entered the war fully aware of its petroleum vulnerability but failed to implement adequate countermeasures. Synthetic fuel programs initiated before the war never achieved production volumes sufficient to replace imported crude oil. Domestic oil fields lacked capacity for significant expansion. The entire Japanese war plan depended on maintaining secure supply lines from the captured Dutch East Indies fields to home islands refineries, a logistical challenge the Imperial Japanese Navy proved incapable of meeting once American submarines began sustained offensive operations. The survey identified pilot training as one of the oil blockade's most strategically significant collateral effects. Japanese training programs collapsed not because of administrative failure or doctrinal inadequacy but because petroleum scarcity made the existing training structure physically impossible to sustain. The report calculated that training a single Imperial Japanese Navy pilot to the standards maintained in 1941 required approximately 1,200 gallons of aviation gasoline, consumed across 400 hours of flight time in trainers and operational aircraft. At peak production in 1943, Japan manufactured approximately 30 million gallons of aviation gasoline monthly. Theoretically, this production could have supported training 25,000 pilots annually to 1941 standards. In practice, combat operations consumed the vast majority of aviation fuel production. Fighters defending against B-29 raids, attack aircraft supporting ground forces, reconnaissance aircraft, and transport operations all demanded priority over training allocations. The residual fuel available for training declined steadily from 1943 onward, forcing progressive reductions in training flight hours. The section analyzing petroleum warfare concluded that the oil blockade implemented through submarine operations proved far more devastating than the strategic bombing campaign against Japanese refineries and fuel storage facilities. The refineries could be rebuilt. Storage tanks could be repaired. But tankers sunk in deep water could not be recovered. Crude oil lost to torpedo attack could not be replaced. The blockade created effects that cascaded through the entire Japanese military structure, degrading capabilities in ways that were irreversible with the resources Japan possessed. The report identified pilot training as one of the blockade's most significant collateral effects. The decline in pilot quality between 1942 and 1945 stemmed directly from fuel scarcity imposed by successful submarine operations. Japan could have implemented alternative training methods earlier, could have prioritized training fuel allocations more aggressively, could have revised tactical doctrine to emphasize quality over quantity. Each alternative faced constraints that made implementation difficult or impossible within Japan's strategic situation. The fundamental problem was mathematical. Japan needed more petroleum than it could access. Every alternative solution required resources Japan did not possess or time it could not afford. The survey documented that by early 1945, Japanese training programs received less than 10% of aviation fuel allocations, insufficient to maintain even the abbreviated curricula implemented in late 1944. Fuel designated for training often faced diversion to combat operations when tactical situations demanded. Training airfields experienced supply interruptions lasting weeks when tanker convoys failed to arrive. The cumulative effect created a training system that existed on paper but could not function in practice. Students sat in classrooms, studied maintenance manuals, practiced on non-functional link trainers, and waited for fuel allocations that allowed actual flight training. Graduates of these programs possessed theoretical knowledge superior to many 1941-era pilots but lacked the practical flying skills necessary for combat operations. They understood aerodynamics, engine management, and tactical doctrine but had never experienced the physical sensations these concepts described. They were, in the assessment of American interrogators who interviewed them after the war, intelligent young men utterly unprepared for the violence they encountered. The contrast with American pilot training during the same period illuminates the relationship between resource availability and military capability. The United States expanded pilot production from approximately 6,000 per year in 1941 to over 64,000 per year by 1944. American training programs lengthened rather than shortened as the war progressed, incorporating lessons learned from combat operations. By 1944, American Navy pilots typically accumulated over 300 hours of flight time before joining operational squadrons, more training than Japanese pilots received in 1941. The United States possessed abundant petroleum supplies, secure from submarine attack. American training airfields could operate without fuel constraints. Instructors could allocate flight hours based on educational requirements rather than petroleum availability. The difference manifested in combat effectiveness that widened progressively as the war continued. American pilot production expanded not merely in numbers but in quality and standardization. In 1941, the United States Navy trained approximately 6,000 pilots using a 9-month curriculum providing approximately 215 hours of flight time. By 1943, the curriculum had expanded to 12 months with 300 hours of flight time. The increase reflected incorporation of combat lessons, recognition that additional preparation produced pilots more likely to survive their first operational deployments. American training commands operated without fuel constraints. Aviation gasoline production in the United States exceeded 10 billion gallons annually by 1944, more than sufficient to support both combat operations and expanded training programs. Training airfields consumed fuel based on educational requirements rather than availability. If a syllabus specified 50 hours of formation flying practice, students received 50 hours regardless of fuel cost. This abundance created efficiencies that compounded over time. Well-trained pilots survived combat at higher rates, retaining institutional knowledge that informed training improvements. The American system created a virtuous cycle where resource availability enabled training quality, which improved combat effectiveness, which preserved experienced personnel who enhanced training programs further. Japan faced the inverse, a vicious cycle where petroleum scarcity degraded training, which reduced combat effectiveness, which increased casualties among the few skilled pilots remaining, which further reduced training quality as experienced instructors were killed. The cycle was mathematically unsustainable. By 1945, Japan produced approximately 2,000 pilots monthly, but these pilots averaged less than 100 hours of flight training. American forces produced approximately 5,000 pilots monthly with more than triple the training time. The quantitative disparity was significant, but the qualitative gap was catastrophic. A Japanese pilot with 100 hours faced an American pilot with 300 hours in combat where skill differential often determined survival within seconds. Japanese courage could not compensate for this preparation disparity any more than courage could enable a fighter aircraft to fly without fuel. The Japanese experience demonstrates that pilot training cannot be compressed below certain thresholds without producing catastrophic effectiveness degradation. Flying military aircraft in combat requires muscle memory developed through hundreds of hours of practice. Theoretical knowledge provides framework but cannot substitute for practical experience. Shortcuts produce pilots who understand what they should do but lack the instinctive capability to execute under pressure. The Imperial Japanese Navy discovered this principle through painful battlefield lessons. Modern air forces ignore this lesson at their peril. The petroleum dimension of warfare extends beyond simple tonnage calculations. Fuel represents strategic enabler that permits or prevents entire categories of military operations. The Japanese Empire possessed skilled engineers, courageous pilots, and sophisticated aircraft designs. It lacked secure access to petroleum in quantities sufficient to sustain its training infrastructure. This single deficiency proved more decisive than any tactical defeat. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated the consequence. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not primarily an aerial combat engagement. It was a massacre of inadequately trained young men, sent into battle in aircraft they barely understood because their nation could no longer provide the fuel necessary to teach them properly. The irony was that Japan went to war in 1941 specifically to secure petroleum supplies from the Dutch East Indies. The nation achieved this objective by March 1942. But Japan could not defend the supply lines connecting those oil fields to home island refineries. American submarines severed that connection systematically between 1943 and 1945. The oil Japan went to war to secure became strategically irrelevant because the oil never reached Japanese forces in quantities adequate to sustain operations. The Imperial Japanese Navy's pilot training program, once the finest in the world, collapsed under the weight of this failure. The young men who flew in 1945 possessed courage equivalent to the Pearl Harbor veterans. They lacked the 400 hours of training that transformed courage into capability. That training required fuel Japan no longer possessed. Conclusion: the price of petroleum. The Pacific War's outcome was determined by many factors, but petroleum scarcity stands as perhaps the most decisive single constraint on Japanese military capability. The fuel shortage manifested across every dimension of Japanese operations. Naval vessels remained in port for lack of bunker fuel. Trucks sat immobile for want of diesel. Industrial production declined as petroleum-based feedstocks became unavailable. But nowhere did the petroleum crisis produce more catastrophic consequences than in pilot training, where fuel scarcity destroyed Japan's capacity to create the skilled aviators necessary for sustained aerial warfare. The progression was systematic and irreversible. In 1941, Japan possessed the finest naval aviation force in the world, products of a training infrastructure that demanded years of preparation and consumed vast quantities of aviation gasoline in pursuit of excellence. In 1942, this system began to buckle under the pressure of wartime attrition and emerging fuel constraints. Training hours started declining, veteran instructor pilots were reassigned to combat units, curriculum shortcuts appeared. In 1943, the fuel crisis deepened as American submarines achieved increasing success against Japanese tankers. Training programs implemented emergency modifications, eliminating advanced instruction, reducing flight hours, substituting classroom theory for practical experience. In 1944, the system collapsed entirely, producing pilots with marginal skills facing combat conditions they were unprepared to survive. In 1945, powered flight training ceased, replaced by gliders and ground school, a final admission that Japan could no longer prepare pilots for modern aerial warfare. American industrial production outpaced Japanese manufacturing capacity by orders of magnitude. American cryptographic intelligence penetrated Japanese communications, providing strategic advantages. American doctrine evolved through combat experience more rapidly than Japanese rigidity permitted. But underlying all these factors was a simpler reality: the United States possessed secure petroleum supplies and Japan did not. This fundamental asymmetry doomed Japanese strategy regardless of tactical skill or operational brilliance. The pilot training crisis that emerged from fuel scarcity represents one of the war's clearest illustrations of this principle. In 1941, Japanese naval aviators were arguably the finest in the world, products of a training system that demanded excellence and provided the resources necessary to achieve it. By 1945, Japanese replacement pilots were among the most poorly prepared combat aviators of any major power, victims of a training system that retained theoretical sophistication but lacked the fuel to implement its own doctrine. The transformation occurred not through philosophical choice but through resource constraint. Japan's training standards collapsed because petroleum supplies collapsed. The young men who graduated from abbreviated programs in late 1944 and early 1945 received inadequate preparation not because their instructors were incompetent but because Japan could not provide the fuel necessary for adequate training. The ghosts of these pilots haunt the historical record. They appear in American combat reports as easy victories, Japanese aircraft that fell without meaningful resistance. They appear in Japanese operational logs as casualties, names recorded without details. They appear in photographs of burning aircraft and pilots who never reached their 20th birthday. They were not cowards. They were not fools. They were products of a system that asked them to accomplish missions for which they had not been prepared, flying aircraft they had barely mastered, against opponents whose training they could not match. The fuel shortage destroyed them before they ever encountered American fighters. The human dimension of this failure demands recognition. The young men who graduated from Japanese training programs in late 1944 and 1945 were not lesser individuals than the Pearl Harbor veterans. They possessed equivalent intelligence, courage, and dedication to their nation. Many came from the same schools, the same social backgrounds, carried the same warrior ethos that had animated their predecessors. What they lacked was time and fuel, the two resources necessary to transform raw potential into combat capability. The instructors who attempted to train them understood this tragedy intimately. These instructors were often veterans of earlier Pacific battles, men who had themselves completed rigorous training and survived combat through skills acquired over hundreds of flight hours. They watched students graduate with barely one-quarter the preparation the instructors themselves had received, knowing these students faced American pilots whose training exceeded even the standards of 1941 Japanese aviators. The instructors could do nothing to change this reality. Fuel did not exist to provide adequate training. Combat demanded continuous replacement pilots. The system produced what circumstances permitted, not what mission requirements demanded. The strategic implications extended beyond the immediate tactical sphere. Japan's fuel crisis prevented the nation from adapting to changing technological and doctrinal conditions. American aviation evolved rapidly during the Pacific War. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat that entered service in 1943 represented a fundamental shift in fighter design philosophy, emphasizing firepower, armor protection, and high-speed performance over the maneuverability that characterized earlier designs. The Hellcat could not outturn a Zero in slow-speed dogfighting, but it did not need to. American tactics emphasized high-speed slashing attacks where the Hellcat's superior speed and firepower negated Japanese maneuverability advantages. Countering these tactics required extensive training in energy management, boom and zoom combat, and coordinated defensive tactics. Japanese pilots receiving less than 100 hours of total flight time could not master these advanced techniques. They learned to fly aircraft and execute basic maneuvers but lacked the experience necessary to employ sophisticated tactics. When they encountered Hellcats in combat, they attempted to force turning engagements where zero maneuverability might provide advantage. Skilled American pilots refused these engagements, maintaining speed and altitude advantage, attacking from superior positions, breaking away before Japanese fighters could respond. The tactical mismatch stemmed directly from training disparities created by fuel shortages. The Battle of the Philippine Sea represented this dynamic at fleet scale, but the pattern repeated thousands of times in smaller engagements throughout 1944 and 1945. American combat reports from this period describe encounters that barely qualified as aerial combat. Japanese formations that disintegrated under initial attack. Pilots who attempted to evade by executing shallow turns that preserved their position in American gun sights. Aircraft that flew into terrain because pilots lost situational awareness during high-G maneuvering. These were not isolated incidents but systematic patterns revealing training deficiencies. American intelligence analysts recognized that Japanese pilot quality had degraded beyond recovery. The projections were straightforward: Japan could continue producing aircraft and graduates from abbreviated training programs, but these resources would translate to minimal combat effectiveness. The war's outcome was determined, only the timeline remained uncertain. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 prevented the final act of this tragedy from unfolding. Operation Downfall, the planned American invasion of the home islands, would have encountered the last remnants of Japanese air power, thousands of aircraft with pilots averaging fewer than 100 hours of flight experience, many designated for kamikaze missions. Japanese planning documents captured after the war reveal that operational commanders held no illusions about their forces' capabilities. They understood that their pilots were inadequately trained, their aircraft were obsolete, their fuel supplies were exhausted. But surrender was politically unacceptable to the factions controlling Japanese policy. The invasion never occurred, and the hypothetical performance of these minimally trained pilots remains unknowable. What is certain is that the fuel shortage had already destroyed Japanese aviation as an effective military force months before Japan's formal surrender. The historical lesson transcends the specific circumstances of the Pacific War. Modern military forces ignore the relationship between resource availability and training infrastructure at existential peril. Petroleum remains the foundation of military mobility and air power. Nations that lack secure access to adequate fuel supplies cannot sustain the training systems necessary to create competent military aviation forces. Shortcuts and abbreviations in training produce superficially qualified personnel who lack the depth of skill required for combat effectiveness. The time required to develop competent pilots cannot be compressed beyond certain thresholds without catastrophic degradation in capability. Japan discovered this principle through bitter experience. The empire entered the Pacific War with superb pilots and inadequate petroleum supplies. It concluded the war with adequate pilot numbers and catastrophically inadequate pilot quality. The transformation occurred because fuel scarcity made comprehensive training impossible, and no quantity of courage or determination could substitute for the preparation that fuel constraints prevented. The young men who flew Japanese aircraft in the war's final year deserved better than the circumstances they inherited. They deserved training systems adequate to their missions. They deserved fuel sufficient to develop their skills. They deserved tactical situations where courage might influence outcomes. Instead, they received abbreviated instruction, flew on fuel reserves barely sufficient to reach combat zones, and died in engagements where their inadequate preparation guaranteed defeat. The responsibility for this tragedy rests not with the pilots but with the strategic decisions that led Japan into war without securing the petroleum resources necessary to sustain its military operations. The fuel crisis that destroyed Japanese pilot training was foreseeable and preventable. Japanese planners understood their nation's petroleum vulnerability before Pearl Harbor. They gambled that rapid conquest of the Dutch East Indies would solve this vulnerability. They lost that gamble when American submarines severed the supply lines connecting those oil fields to home islands refineries. The young pilots of 1945 paid the price for strategic failures made years earlier by men who were safely distant from the consequences of their decisions. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.